good morning, afternoon. Hurt has a way of carving deep into our hearts, doesn't it? It's sharp and loud at first, but then if left unacknowledged, it turns quiet, settling into silence. And sometimes what hurts even more is knowing that the people around you saw the pain and chose not to act. Let me say this: being in pain doesn't make you weak. Admitting you're hurting doesn't make you a burden. It makes you human. But here's the hard truth: we live in a world that struggles to hold space for vulnerability. When we open up, we sometimes feel dismissed or ignored, and that creates scars. I want to start by saying this isn't about pointing fingers or blaming. People aren't always equipped to handle someone else's pain. They may care deeply but feel paralyzed by their own fear of saying or doing the wrong thing. Compassion fatigue is real. And when someone senses your pain but doesn't show up, it's often because they're drowning in their own uncertainty. But here's the thing: we don't need people to have all the right words or solutions. We just need them to show up. We need presence. We need a willingness to lean into the discomfort and say, I don't have all the answers, but I'm here. When someone chooses silence instead, it feels like abandonment. And that silence, it speaks. It says, your pain isn't enough for me to step into discomfort. And even if that's not what they mean, it's often what we hear. But let me flip this for a moment. How many times have we been the ones who didn't show up? Not because we didn't care, but because we didn't know how to. Empathy isn't always instinctive, it's a practice. It's not about fixing someone else's pain or having the perfect words. It's about being brave enough to sit in the mess with them, offering nothing more than our presence. Healing doesn't always come from grand gestures. Sometimes it's born from accountability. If someone missed your pain, if they knew and stayed silent, there's room for honest conversation. Naming the hurt can rebuild trust. It's a difficult road, but it's one worth traveling. So today, I want to leave you with this: don't let fear stop you from showing up. If you know someone is hurting, be brave enough to say, I see you and I care. And if you're the one hurting, know this: your pain matters and you deserve people who will hold space for it. Because in the end, healing doesn't happen in isolation. It happens when we step into the uncomfortable together. The courage of vulnerability lies at the very heart of what it means to be human. It's a paradox, really. Vulnerability feels like exposure, like standing on a stage without armor, letting the world see what we spent so much time trying to hide. Yet in that exposure, there is extraordinary power, the power to connect, to be seen, and to heal. It takes tremendous bravery to acknowledge when we're hurting. Society often equates strength with stoicism, with the ability to endure silently and never let anyone see us falter. But there's no greater strength than being honest about our struggles. It's not easy to admit when we're breaking under the weight of life, when we're carrying burdens that feel too heavy to bear alone. Vulnerability asks us to take a risk, to let someone in, knowing full well they might not know how to respond, or worse, they might not respond at all. Why would anyone choose to be vulnerable then? Because vulnerability is the birthplace of connection. Think about the moments in your life when you've truly bonded with someone, not the surface level exchanges or polite conversations, but the raw, soul deep connections. Those moments almost always begin when someone lets their guard down and says, this is where I am, this is where I am, this is what I'm feeling, this is what I'm carrying. When we allow ourselves to be vulnerable, we create space for others to meet us there. But let's be honest, vulnerability is terrifying. There's a reason so many of us avoid it. To be vulnerable is to take off the mask and risk rejection or misunderstanding. It's to risk being met with silence when what we need most is support. And for those of us who have been vulnerable before and felt that silence, it can feel like a betrayal, like confirmation that the world isn't a safe place for us to show who we truly are. Yet, here's the truth: avoiding vulnerability doesn't protect us from pain, it only isolates us. When we build walls to keep others from seeing our struggles, we also block out the possibility of comfort, understanding, and love. We end up trapped inside our own hurt, convinced that no one can or will reach us. The courage to be vulnerable doesn't mean we share everything with everyone. It means we choose carefully and intentionally to let down our guard with the people who matter most, the ones we trust to handle our hearts with care. It's about saying, this is who I am, even in my messiest, most unpolished moments. When we embrace vulnerability, we also give others permission to do the same. It's a ripple effect. By saying, I'm not okay, we create a safe space for someone else to say, I'm struggling too. Vulnerability invites authenticity. And authenticity is where real relationships begin. But here's something else we need to remember. Vulnerability isn't just about sharing our struggles, it's also about showing up for others. When we see someone in pain, it takes courage to step into their world and say, I'm here for you. It's uncomfortable, messy, and sometimes awkward, but it's also one of the most profound gifts we can give. To meet someone in their vulnerability and respond with empathy is to remind them that they're not alone. The courage of vulnerability transforms both the giver and the receiver. It teaches us that strength isn't about having all the answers or never breaking down. It's about being brave enough to lean into uncertainty and trust that connection is worth the risk. It's about standing in the truth of our experiences, however imperfect, and finding that even in our most vulnerable moments, we are enough. So let us dare to be vulnerable, not because it's easy, but because it's necessary. Let us take the risk to show up for ourselves and for each other, knowing that vulnerability is not weakness, but the truest measure of courage. Recognizing compassion fatigue begins with understanding its subtle but profound presence. Compassion fatigue is not a failure of care, nor is it a lack of empathy. Instead, it's what happens when the weight of witnessing and responding to the pain of others begins to overwhelm our emotional capacity. It can sneak up on anyone, particularly those who are naturally empathetic or in roles that demand constant caregiving, support, or emotional labor. At its core, compassion fatigue reflects the limits of our humanity. No matter how deeply we care, our resources aren't infinite. When we're constantly exposed to the struggles of others, our emotional reserves can become depleted. We may find ourselves feeling distant, numb, or irritable. We might withdraw, not because we don't care, but because caring feels too heavy in that moment. It's important to recognize that compassion fatigue is not a weakness or a character flaw. It's a natural response to prolonged emotional strain. When someone is hurting, we often want to help, to fix, to carry some of their burden. But when we are faced with repeated or intense exposure to pain, whether it's through our loved ones, our work, or even the world around us, our ability to sustain that level of engagement can falter. Compassion fatigue can show up in many ways. Sometimes it looks like an inability to engage emotionally with someone's pain, even when we desperately want to. Other times it manifests as frustration, where we feel irritated or resentful at being needed. For some, it becomes a sense of helplessness, where they feel like nothing they do will make a difference, leading to withdrawal or avoidance. One of the challenges of compassion fatigue is its invisibility. It often operates in the background, gradually chipping away at our emotional resilience. It doesn't announce itself loudly or demand immediate attention. Instead, it slowly builds until we realize that our ability to care deeply has been compromised. The key to recognizing compassion fatigue is self-awareness. It requires us to check in with ourselves regularly and honestly. Are we feeling drained or overwhelmed? Do we find ourselves avoiding interactions that used to feel meaningful? Are we quicker to anger or slower to offer kindness? These signs are not failures, they're signals that we need to pause and tend to our own well-being. Compassion fatigue also thrives in silence and shame. Too often, people hesitate to acknowledge it because they fear it makes them seem selfish or unkind. But the reality is, we can't pour from an empty cup. When we neglect our own needs, we're not only hurting ourselves, we're also limiting our ability to be present for others. Recognizing compassion fatigue is the first step toward replenishing our emotional reserves and re-engaging with the world in a healthier, more sustainable way. This recognition isn't just about protecting ourselves, it's about honoring the relationships and commitments that matter most to us. When we allow ourselves to rest, to seek support, and to set boundaries, we're not stepping away from compassion, we're fortifying it. By caring for ourselves, we ensure that our compassion remains a source of strength rather than a source of exhaustion. Acknowledging compassion fatigue is an act of courage. It's a way of saying, I matter too. It's a reminder that we are not limitless, but we are capable of incredible resilience when we treat ourselves with the same care and compassion we offer to others. And in recognizing it, we create space not only to heal ourselves, but to continue showing up for those who need us with a fuller heart and a stronger spirit. The importance of showing up cannot be overstated. It's one of the simplest yet most profound ways we demonstrate care and connection to the people around us. Showing up doesn't mean having all the answers, fixing someone's pain, or delivering a perfect response. It's about being present fully, authentically, and without hesitation in someone's moment of need. When we show up for someone, we're saying, I see you, I hear you, I'm here for you. Those words, even when unspoken, carry immense weight. In times of struggle, people don't always need solutions. Often, what they crave most is the reassurance that they're not alone. Our presence becomes a lifeline, a reminder that their pain is seen and their existence matters. Yet showing up isn't always easy. It requires vulnerability on our part. It means stepping into uncomfortable spaces where we might not know what to say or do. It means confronting our own fears of inadequacy, our worry that we'll say the wrong thing, or our discomfort with someone else's pain. But here's the truth: showing up imperfectly is infinitely better than not showing up at all. Silence or absence in moments of need can feel like abandonment, even if it's not intended that way. When we hesitate to show up, it's often because we believe we're not equipped to handle the situation. We think, what if I say the wrong thing? What if I say the wrong thing? What if I make it worse? But the reality is, most people aren't looking for perfection, they're looking for presence. A simple, I don't know what to say, but I'm here for you can mean the world to someone who feels lost in their pain. It's not about fixing the unfixable, it's about standing beside someone while they navigate their journey. Showing up also requires us to let go of the expectation that we need to offer grand gestures. Sometimes the smallest acts of presence have the biggest impact. A quick text that says, thinking of you today. A hand on someone's shoulder, or simply sitting quietly with someone in their pain can communicate volumes. These moments remind people that they are valued and supported even when words fail. There's also a transformative power in showing up, not just for the person in need, but for ourselves. When we lean into someone's pain, we're reminded of our shared humanity. We realize that no matter how different our experiences may seem, we all yearn for connection, understanding, and care. By showing up, we break down the walls of isolation that often accompany pain, creating a bridge where healing can begin. Of course, showing up isn't just about responding to someone's moment of crisis. It's also about the consistency of presence over time. It's the follow-up call a week later, the check-in long after the initial shock of an event has passed. Pain doesn't follow a timeline, and neither should our support. Sometimes the most meaningful showing up happens when everyone else has moved on, but you're still there, quietly holding space. It's also worth acknowledging that showing up isn't always convenient. Life is busy and the demands on our time and energy are constant. But when we choose to show up for someone, we're prioritizing what truly matters. We're saying, your pain, your joy, your life, it matters to me. That choice, even when it feels small, can leave an indelible mark on someone's heart. In the end, showing up is about connection. It's about being willing to step into someone else's story, not to change it, but to witness it. It's about saying, you don't have to carry this alone. And in a world that often feels disconnected and hurried, the simple act of showing up can be the most powerful form of love we can offer. Silence, especially in moments of pain, can be profoundly hurtful. When someone is struggling, they often look to those around them for connection, understanding, or at least acknowledgement of what they're going through. In those moments, silence doesn't just feel like absence, it feels like rejection. It can amplify the pain, making it seem as though their struggles are invisible or unworthy of attention. Pain is inherently isolating. It creates a barrier between the person suffering and the rest of the world. A kind word, a gesture of support, or even a simple acknowledgement has the power to breach that barrier and remind someone they are not alone. But when silence takes its place, the isolation deepens. It sends an unintended message: your pain isn't seen. It isn't significant. You don't matter enough for me to respond. Even when that's not the intention, it's often how it's interpreted. What makes silence so painful is the ambiguity it creates. In the absence of words or actions, the mind starts to fill the void with assumptions. Why aren't they saying anything? Don't they care? Are they angry with me? Am I asking for too much? These unanswered questions become a breeding ground for doubt and insecurity. The silence doesn't just remain empty, it grows heavy, carrying the weight of unspoken fears and imagined reasons. For someone who is vulnerable enough to share their pain, silence can feel like a betrayal. It takes courage to open up about struggles, especially in a world that often glorifies strength and resilience. When that courage is met with silence, it can feel as though the risk of vulnerability was a mistake, as if the act of sharing wasn't worth it. That kind of hurt can make people retreat further into themselves, afraid to express their feelings or reach out again. But silence isn't always intentional or malicious. Often people remain silent because they don't know what to say. They fear saying the wrong thing, worry about making the situation worse, or feel overwhelmed by their own discomfort. They may care deeply but freeze in the moment, unsure how to navigate the terrain of someone else's pain. While understandable, this hesitation can still leave the person in need feeling abandoned. Even when words are imperfect or clumsy, they can be more powerful than silence. A simple "I don't know what to say, but I'm here for you" can make all the difference. It's not about fixing the problem or offering solutions. It's about acknowledging the reality of someone's pain. Showing up with empathy, even when you're unsure of the right words, is far more meaningful than staying quiet out of fear. Silence also has a way of lingering. Long after the moment has passed, the memory of someone's absence can remain. It becomes a wound that's hard to heal because it's tied not just to the original pain, but to the sense of being unseen or unsupported. This is why silence, even if unintentional, can cause more lasting harm than a well-meant but imperfect response. Breaking the silence doesn't require grand gestures or profound statements. It starts with presence. A text, a call, or even sitting quietly beside someone can be enough to convey care. It's about letting the person know, "I see you and I'm here." Those small acts of acknowledgement can pierce through the isolation and remind someone that they matter, that their pain is not too much, and that they are not forgotten. In the end, silence can hurt more because it feels like indifference, even when it's not. Words and actions, no matter how simple, show that someone is willing to step into the discomfort with us, to bear witness to our pain, and to remind us that we are not alone. Choosing to break the silence is a courageous act of connection, one that can bring light into even the darkest of moments. Practicing empathy starts with listening, truly listening. Most of us are conditioned to listen with the intent to respond, to offer advice, or share our own experiences. But empathy requires us to listen with the intent to understand. It's about creating space for someone to share their story, their pain, their truth, without interruption or the pressure to move past it. When we listen with empathy, we silence our inner urge to solve or compare and instead focus entirely on the other person's perspective. This kind of listening demands presence. It's not enough to nod along or give a few polite acknowledgments while our mind wanders. Empathy asks us to show up fully, to tune in, not just to the words being spoken, but to the emotions behind them. It's about paying attention to what isn't being said, the pauses, the tone, the expressions that reveal the depth of what someone is experiencing. Empathy also requires us to set aside our own assumptions and judgments. It's easy to fall into the trap of thinking, "I wouldn't feel that way," or "they should just do this instead." But those thoughts only create distance. Practicing empathy means accepting that someone's feelings are valid simply because they feel them. It's not our job to decide whether their emotions are justified. It's our job to honor them. At its heart, empathy is about connection, not solutions. It's tempting to want to fix someone's pain, to offer advice or reassurances in an attempt to make things better. But often what people need most isn't answers, it's to feel seen and heard. Empathy says, "I may not have the solution, but I'm here with you. I see you. I feel with you." That kind of presence can be more healing than any words of advice. Empathy is also a practice of humility. It requires us to admit that we don't always understand what someone is going through, and that's okay. It's about saying, I don't know exactly how you feel, but I want to try to understand. That willingness to step into someone else's world, even imperfectly, is what makes empathy so powerful. It's not about getting it right, it's about being willing to show up. Practicing empathy takes effort, especially in moments when we're tired, overwhelmed, or unsure of how to respond. It's easy to withdraw or avoid when someone's pain feels too heavy. But empathy isn't about taking on someone else's burden. It's about sitting beside them in their struggle. It's a reminder that we don't have to fix their situation to be a source of comfort. Over time, practicing empathy can transform our relationships and the way we see the world. It teaches us to slow down, to pay attention, and to value the experiences of others. It reminds us that everyone is carrying something we may not see, and our willingness to care, to listen, and to connect can make a profound difference. Empathy isn't always instinctive, but it's always worth the effort. It's a practice that brings us closer together, that bridges the gaps between us, and that allows us to support each other in meaningful human ways. By choosing empathy, we choose connection, compassion, and the possibility of healing, not just for others, but for ourselves as well. Healing through accountability is a process that requires courage, honesty, and a willingness to face difficult truths. Accountability often gets a bad reputation because it's associated with blame or punishment, but in its truest form, it's about growth and restoration. It's about taking responsibility for our actions, acknowledging the harm we've caused, and committing to change. Far from being a burden, accountability can be a powerful tool for healing, both for those who take responsibility and for those who have been hurt. At its core, accountability begins with self-awareness. It's about recognizing the impact of our actions, words, or decisions, even when that recognition is uncomfortable. It means stepping outside of our own intentions and seeing things from another person's perspective. What we intended may not align with how our actions were received, and accountability bridges that gap by validating the feelings and experiences of others. Taking accountability isn't about self-condemnation. It's not about dwelling in shame or labeling ourselves as irredeemable. Instead, it's an act of humility. It's saying, I see where I went wrong. I understand how my actions affected you, and I'm committed to making it right. This kind of accountability opens the door to healing because it addresses the harm directly rather than avoiding or minimizing it. It acknowledges that while we can't undo the past, we can take steps to repair the present and build a better future. For those who have been hurt, accountability from the person who caused the harm can be deeply validating. It acknowledges their pain and assures them that their experiences matter. When someone says, I hurt you, and I'm sorry, it can be a turning point in the healing process. It shifts the narrative from one of unresolved pain to one of mutual understanding and potentially reconciliation. Healing through accountability also involves making amends. Apologies are important, but they're only the beginning. True accountability requires action, a tangible effort to address the harm and prevent it from happening again. This could mean seeking guidance, learning new skills, or changing behaviors that contributed to the issue. It's not about perfection, it's about consistent, genuine effort to grow and do better. This process is rarely easy. Taking accountability means confronting our own flaws and mistakes, which can be painful. It often brings up feelings of guilt, embarrassment, or vulnerability. But it's in that discomfort that transformation happens. When we lean into accountability, we give ourselves the chance to become more self-aware, compassionate, and aligned with our values. Accountability also fosters trust. When we take responsibility for our actions, we show others that we are reliable and committed to growth. This trust is essential in repairing damaged relationships. Without accountability, hurt feelings can fester and create distance. But when we own our mistakes and take steps to make things right, we pave the way for reconnection and understanding. Healing through accountability doesn't mean we'll never make mistakes again. It's not a one-time event, but an ongoing commitment to learning and improving. It requires patience with ourselves and with others. Sometimes the person we've hurt may not be ready to forgive, and that's okay. Accountability is about showing up consistently, even when the outcome is uncertain. Ultimately, healing through accountability is a gift we give not only to others, but also to ourselves. It frees us from the weight of denial, defensiveness, or unresolved guilt. It allows us to grow into more authentic and compassionate versions of ourselves. And it reminds us that while we can't always control the impact of our actions, we can control how we respond to them, and that response can be a powerful force for healing. In the end, accountability is not about perfection, it's about presence, courage, and the willingness to face our imperfections with honesty. It's a practice of acknowledging harm, taking responsibility, and committing to meaningful change. Through accountability, we create space for healing both for those we've hurt and for ourselves. It reminds us that while we cannot rewrite the past, we can take ownership of our actions and shape a better future. True accountability strengthens relationships, builds trust, and fosters connection. It transforms moments of conflict or pain into opportunities for growth and understanding. When we choose to show up, to own our mistakes, and to make amends, we reaffirm the value of those around us and the integrity within ourselves. Healing through accountability is not always easy, but it is always worth it. It is a path to wholeness, a demonstration of care, and a profound act of courage. In taking responsibility, we honor the humanity in others and in ourselves, proving that even in our missteps, there is the potential for transformation and grace.